The exam room smelled of antiseptic and cold anticipation. I lay back on the paper sheet, gripping the edges as Dr. Thorne glided the wand over my belly. I expected the rhythmic whoosh of a heartbeat. Instead, the room went silent. At my ultrasound, the doctor started shaking. She pulled me aside and said, "You need to leave. Now?" "Get a divorce," I asked. "Why?" She replied, "No time to explain. You'll understand when you see this." What she showed me made my blood boil. The screen went black. Dr. Thorne didn't just turn off the monitor. She yanked the cord like it was burning her hand. My heart hammered against my ribs. A frantic drumbeat that had nothing to do with the baby. Sunlight sliced through the blinds, illuminating dust motes dancing in the heavy silence. "Is the baby okay?" I whispered, my voice cracking. She didn't answer. She walked to the door, locked it with a sharp click, and leaned against the wood. Her professional mask had completely dissolved into terror. Something was wrong, but not medically. "Sit up, Eliana." Her command was sharp, stripping away the gentle bedside manner I had known for years. I sat up, pulling my gown closed, feeling suddenly exposed. She reached into her lab coat pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. It wasn't a medical chart or a prescription. It was a handwritten letter on plain notebook paper, the edges frayed. Her hand trembled as she extended it toward me. "My nurse gave me this an hour ago," she said. She couldn't live with guilt. I took the paper. My own hands were steady, a strange contrast to hers. The handwriting was jagged, written in a rush. I read the first line and the air left my lungs. It detailed a transaction that had taken place 7 months ago in this clinic. A swap. A bribe. My husband, Julian. The man who had cried when he saw the positive test hadn't just come for support. He had come to ensure own sterile sample was replaced. The ink blurred into a nightmare. It wasn't just a betrayal. It was a complex architectural fraud. The letter listed a donor ID and a cash payment of $30,000. Julian didn't want a child. He wanted an heir to secure his access to my family trust. The infertility tears, the months of comforting him, the expensive treatments were all a performance. I looked up at Dr. Thorne. She wasn't looking at me with pity. She was looking at me with fear. She knew who Julian really was before I did. "Take the file," she whispered. "Leave through the back. If he knows you know. You aren't safe." I slid off the table, my legs feeling like lead. I grabbed the folder and my purse. I didn't say thank you. There are no words for the moment your life ends. I walked out into the blinding afternoon sun. The heat hit me like a physical blow. I walked toward my car, clutching the proof of his crime, and for the first time, I stopped crying. I threw the folder onto the passenger seat, like it was a loaded gun. The leather interior of my SUV burned my legs, but I was shivering. I turned the key, and the engine purred to life, mocking me with its reliable hum. My hands gripped the steering wheel, until my knuckles turned white. I needed to drive, to move, to put distance between myself and that clinic. But every mile felt like I was driving backward into a memory. The road blurred ahead. 4 years ago, at the annual charity gala, I met the man I thought I knew. Julian had been standing by the bar, complaining about the cheap champagne. He asked me what I did for a living without once glancing at the diamond necklace my grandmother left me. "I am just a financial planner," he had said with a crooked, boyish grin. "I don't fit in with these trust fund types." It was the perfect line. It was exactly what I wanted to hear. My mother, Catherine, saw through the veneer instantly. She watched him from across the ballroom that night like a hawk circling a field mouse. "He is too polished. Eliana," she warned me later in the library. "A man who claims not to care about money doesn't attend galas." I called her cynical. I cut her out of my life because she dared to question his love. Now, the memory of her sad resignation tasted like ash in my mouth. The deception deepened when we started trying for a baby. The fertility specialist delivered the news of his sterility in a sterile white room much like Dr. Thorne's. Julian crumbled. He wept in my arms, apologizing for being broken. I held him, stroking his hair, promising we would fix it together. I thought I was comforting a devastated husband. I was actually applauding a sociopath, giving the performance of a lifetime. Those weren't tears of grief. They were tears of absolute, calculated relief. He was the one who found the clinic 2 towns over. He insisted on the long drive, claiming we needed privacy from our social circle. We don't want the gossip columnists finding out, he argued, squeezing my hand. I thought he was protecting my dignity. In reality, he was protecting his investment. He needed a facility far enough away where he could bribe a nurse without running into anyone who knew the Wilson family name. I had thanked him for his thoughtfulness. The traffic light turned red, and I slammed on the brakes too hard. The folder slid forward, hitting the dashboard. The motive wasn't love or even a desire for fatherhood. It was the trust fund. My grandmother's estate had a stipulation about heirs and direct lineage for releasing the principal. Julian didn't want a child to love. He wanted a biological key to unlock the vault. He had manufactured an heir using a stranger's DNA to bypass the legal safeguards. I pulled into our long, gravel driveway, the tires crunching loudly in the quiet afternoon. The house loomed ahead, a sprawling colonial that suddenly felt like a prison. Through the front bay window, I saw him. Julian was on the phone, pacing the living room, laughing at something the person on the other end said. He looked relaxed. He looked happy. He had no idea that the woman walking toward the front door was no longer his wife, but his executioner. I shoved the clinic folder deep into my tote bag, burying it under crumpled receipts and protein bars. Taking a breath, I unlocked the front door. The cool air conditioning hit my sweat, dampened skin instantly, chilling the sweat on my back. Julian looked up from his phone, that practiced smile plastering itself onto his face. "Hey, babe. How did it go? Is the little bean okay?" I forced the corners of my mouth up. "Perfect?" I lied. "Everything is absolutely perfect." He didn't even ask to see the ultrasound picture. He kissed my cheek, his lips feeling like dry paper against my skin, and pivoted immediately. "That's great, really. Listen. I was thinking about the trust updates." He followed me into the kitchen, crowding my personal space. "With the baby coming, we really need to secure that power of attorney. Just in case something happens during delivery." The urgency in his voice wasn't concern. It was hunger. He was practically salivating. I opened the fridge to hide my trembling hands, staring at the rows of sparkling water. "Julian, I can't think about legal stuff right now. The doctor said my blood pressure is a little high." I grabbed a pitcher, the glass slippery in my grip. "I just need to rest. Can we talk about selling the estate later?" His jaw tightened visibly. The mask slipped for a fraction of a second, revealing the annoyance underneath. "Eliana, we can't keep putting this off." I pleaded a migraine and retreated to the master bedroom. I lay there for hours, staring at the ceiling fan spinning like a dull blade above our bed. Downstairs, the floorboards creaked as he paced back and forth. Around midnight, the house finally went silent. I crept out of the sheets, my bare feet silent on the plush carpet. I needed to know who he was talking to earlier. His phone was usually glued to his hand, but he slept deeply. I reached for his sleek smartphone on the nightstand. But then I saw a faint blue light coming from his jacket pocket on the chair. A second phone. My heart hammered against my ribs as I pulled it out. It was a cheap prepaid model, the kind criminals used in bad movies. There was no passcode. I pressed the home button, and the screen lit up with a string of text messages. The sender was listed only as Mr. V. I read the most recent message and the bile rose in my throat. Extension denied. Payment in full by Friday or we contact the wife. I scrolled up, my thumb hovering over the glass. There were photos attached to previous messages. Not of me, but of Julian walking to his car, Julian at the gym, Julian entering our house. They were watching him. Please, just one more week, Julian had replied. She's going to sign the papers. I'll have the liquidity. He wasn't just greedy. He was a drowning man trying to use me as a life raft. I put the phone back exactly how I found it. My hands were shaking again, but this time it wasn't from shock. It was from clarity. Julian owed serious money to dangerous people. That was his weakness. I crept back into bed and looked at his sleeping face. He had no idea I was about to let the sharks eat him. I drove 2 towns over to a coffee shop that smelled of burnt beans and floor cleaner. My private investigator, Rosalind, was already in the back booth. She looked like a retired librarian, small and gray, but her eyes were sharp enough to cut glass. She didn't offer a greeting. She just slid a thick manila envelope across the scratched table between us. "You aren't going to like this," she said, her voice dry. "But you paid for the truth." I opened the clasp, my fingers numb. The first stack of papers was a financial autopsy of my husband. It was worse than I thought. Julian wasn't just broke, he was underwater. $240,000 in gambling debts. Rosalind explained, tapping a spreadsheet. Online poker. Offshore accounts, underground sports books. The numbers swam before my eyes. He had lost $250,000 while pretending to be a financial genius. He was a complete fraud. Where did he get the money to pay the interest? I asked, though I feared the answer. Rosalind flipped the page. Client accounts. He's been skimming from the firm's elderly investors. My stomach dropped. Embezzlement was a felony that carried real prison time. Julian was stealing from grandmothers to pay thugs. If this got out, his career wouldn't just be over, he would be behind bars for a decade. He wasn't just desperate. He was already a criminal. I pushed the financial records aside. What about the clinic? The donor? Rosalind pulled out a photograph of a young man with kind eyes and a familiar jawline. Derek Sykes. Med student, drowning in loans. Julian paid him $10,000 cash to keep his mouth shut. I stared at the face of my child's biological father. He looked decent, scared, and young. He wasn't a villain. He was just another person Julian had exploited to build his lie. Then came the photos I expected but dreaded. Grainy shots of Julian entering a motel off the highway. "Who is she?" I asked, my voice steady. "His assistant, Sarah. She thinks he's leaving you once the trust fund unlocks." I looked at the image of them laughing in a parking lot. He had promised her a future built on my grandmother's money. He was selling the same dream to her that he had sold to me. It was pathetic. Rosalind leaned in, lowering her voice. "But here is the kicker, Eliana. He bought a DNA test kit online last week." I frowned, confused. "Why?" "He knows he isn't the father." Rosalind's expression turned grim. "Exactly. He plans to demand a test publicly. When it proves he isn't the dad, he's gonna claim you cheated." The room spun. He was gonna use his own fraud to frame me for adultery. It was diabolical. The prenup. Of course. The infidelity clause would void my protection and grant him a massive payout. He wasn't just hiding a secret, he was building a weapon. I gathered the photos and documents, sliding them back into the envelope. The fear that had gripped me for days evaporated, replaced by cold, hard resolve. "Let him buy the test," I said, standing up. "I'll make sure he gets to use it." I knew exactly when to strike. 3 weeks later. I sat across from Julian at the breakfast table. The morning sunlight hit the crystal orange juice pitcher, fracturing into rainbows on the white tablecloth. It was a beautiful setting for a betrayal. I pushed my scrambled eggs around the plate, feigning the nesting instinct he expected. "Julian." I started softly, watching him scroll through his phone. "I've been thinking. We should celebrate the baby properly." He looked up, eyes guarded. "What kind of celebration?" The bait was cast. "A garden party." I said, leaning forward slightly. Here at the estate. Friends, family, your colleagues. A real welcome for the next generation. I saw the gears turning behind his dark eyes. He wasn't thinking about balloons or caterers. He was thinking about witnesses. He was thinking about the perfect stage to execute his plan. It would show everyone how happy we are, I added, sweetening the pot. A united front. His smile slowly returned, sharp and predatory. That sounds wonderful, Eliana, he said, reaching across the table to squeeze my hand. His grip was firm, possessive. We can invite the senior partners from the firm. Maybe even some press. The Wilsons always make the society pages. He was already calculating the headlines that would run the next day. Devastated husband discovers wife's betrayal. It was exactly what I wanted. Let's do it next Saturday, he insisted. No point in waiting. He was desperate for a payday. I have an idea too, Julian added, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. We should do something special during the toasts. A gender reveal. Or maybe something even more meaningful. He paused, watching my reaction closely for any sign of panic. A DNA reveal. To show the baby has my genes. It's a new trend. It took every ounce of my control not to laugh. He was handing me the shovel to dig his grave. That sounds unforgettable, I promised. An hour later, I drove to the one place I hadn't visited in 2 years. My mother's house stood on a hill, imposing and cold, much like the woman herself. I parked the car and took a deep breath. I had chosen a con man over her warnings. The shame burned my throat, but I swallowed it down. I needed her. Not for comfort, but for war. I rang the doorbell, smoothing my dress. I hoped she was still angry. Catherine opened the door herself. She looked older, lines of worry etched around her mouth, but her posture was steel stiff. She saw my face, the tension in my jaw, and the thick folder tucked under my arm. She didn't hug me. She didn't ask how I was. You finally woke up, she said simply, stepping aside to let me in. It wasn't an accusation. It was an acknowledgement. We walked to her study without a word. The alliance was formed. I laid everything on her mahogany desk. The PI report, the clinic confession, the financial records. Catherine put on her reading glasses and went to work. She read in silence, turning pages with lethal precision. The party is Saturday, I told her. He plans to trap me there. She looked up, removing her glasses. Her eyes were cold fire. Then we ensure he doesn't leave the property a free man. She reached for the phone. I'll call the prosecutor. The estate gardens were transformed into a theater of wealth. White tents billowed in the warm breeze. Flanking the marble fountain that my grandmother commissioned 50 years ago. Waiters in black vests navigated the crowd with silver trays of champagne. Weaving through the elite of Connecticut society. Julian stood near the rose bushes, holding court with the senior partners of his firm. He threw his head back in laughter. His hand resting casually on the shoulder of a man he was currently embezzling from. It was a masterclass in deception. My mother stood near the veranda. A sentinel in navy silk. We hadn't spoken properly in years, but today she was my general. She caught my eye over the rim of her glass, giving a microscopic nod. It was the signal that the perimeter was secure. The police were waiting in the guest house, out of sight but ready to move on command. I felt a surge of adrenaline that made my fingers tingle. I adjusted my silk shawl, concealing the microphone pack clipped to my dress. I scanned the perimeter for my other players. Derek Sykes, the biological father my husband had purchased like a used car, was dressed as a catering server. He stood by the dessert table, looking terrified and pale, gripping a water pitcher like a lifeline. Near the band, Rosalind blended into the shadows, her camera lens just visible inside her purse. Every piece of evidence was physically present, breathing the same air as the man who thought he owned them. The trap was primed. Julian checked his watch, the heavy gold Rolex I had bought him for our first anniversary. He caught my gaze across the lawn and smiled. Predatory flash of teeth that didn't reach his eyes. He tapped his champagne flute with a silver spoon. The sharp chiming sound cut through the murmuring crowd, silencing the string quartet mid-measure. If I could have everyone's attention for a moment. He called out, his voice projecting easily. The guests turned, faces expectant and smiling. The performance was beginning. He beckoned me to the makeshift stage near the fountain. I walked toward him, placing a hand on my belly, playing the role of the glowing mother-to-be. Eliana and I are so blessed, he announced, wrapping an arm around my waist. The crowd cooed collectively. And because family is everything to us, I wanted to do something special today. He paused for dramatic effect, looking earnestly at our guests. I've ordered a DNA test kit so we can frame the results in the nursery. A ripple of sentimental awe moved through the guests. Oh, how sweet, someone whispered loudly. Julian turned to me, his grip on my waist tightening painfully. This was it. He expected me to pale, to stammer, to refuse in front of everyone, proving my guilt before the test even happened. He waited for the panic. Instead, I smiled up at him, dazzling and bright. That is such a wonderful idea, Julian, I said, my voice steady and amplified by the hidden mic. Julian blinked, his rhythm stumbling for the first time. He hadn't rehearsed for compliance. In fact, I continued, stepping away from his arm to stand behind the podium. I didn't want to wait for a kit to arrive in the mail. I thought we should have the truth today. I reached under the podium shelf and pulled out the thick, black binder I had stashed there an hour ago. The leather cover slammed onto the wood with a heavy, final thud. The crowd went silent, sensing the shift in atmospheric pressure. This wasn't the banter of a happy couple anymore. Julian stared at the binder, his smile frozen in a rictus of confusion. He recognized the logo on the spine. It was from the clinic he had bribed. Eliana, what is this? He asked, his laugh nervous and brittle. You are ruining the surprise. I opened the binder, the metal ring snapping loudly in the quiet garden. No, darling. I am just revealing the real one. I pulled out the first document, holding it up for the front row to see. You wanted to talk about DNA, I said, my voice projecting clear and cold across the lawn. So let's talk about it. Let's talk about the fact that you paid $30,000 to ensure your DNA was nowhere near my child. A collective gasp sucked the air out of the garden. Julian's face drained of blood, turning the color of the white linen tablecloths. The nightmare had arrived. That's a lie, Julian shouted, lunging toward me. But he stopped short when he saw who stepped forward from the dessert table. Derek Sykes took off his server's jacket, standing in his plain button-down shirt, looking exactly like the young man in the photo I held. Julian froze, his eyes darting between me, the boy, and the exit. He looked like a trapped animal, realizing the cage door was already locked. I picked up the microphone again. I am not finished yet. Julian. I didn't give him time to recover from the first blow. I projected the confession letter onto the white tent wall behind me, using a portable projector Rosalind had set up. The handwriting was jagged and undeniable, looming large over the silent guests. This is the sworn statement from the nurse you bribed, I said, pointing to the screen. And this, I gestured to Derek, is the man you exploited because you thought his student loans made him disposable. Derek didn't speak, he didn't have to. His presence was a living accusation. Julian looked at the crowd, searching for an ally, but he found only horrified stares. His mother had dropped her champagne glass, the crystal shattering on the patio stones like a gunshot. She's lying, Julian screamed, his voice cracking with desperation. She's hormonal. It's the pregnancy brain. She's been paranoid for months. He pointed a shaking finger at me. Eliana, stop this insanity. You are embarrassing yourself. It was his favorite tactic. Deployed in front of everyone. He still thought he could charm his way out of a bear trap. I turned the page in the binder, the sound crisp in the heavy air. Let's talk about why you needed the money, Julian. I pulled out the spreadsheet Rosalind had compiled. You didn't just steal my future child's identity. You stole from your own clients. I looked directly at the senior partner standing near the rose bushes. His face was purple with rage. Mr. Henderson, I called out. You might want to check the accounts for the Miller estate. My husband has been using them as his personal piggy bank. The crowd parted around Julian as if he were contagious. I held up the next document. A printout from an offshore betting site. $240,000 in gambling debts. I announced. That is what you owe. That is why you needed access to my trust fund. I tossed the papers into the air. They fluttered down like snow around his polished shoes. You weren't building a family. You were looking for a bailout. He looked at the scattering papers, his mouth opening and closing silently. But you had a backup plan, didn't you? I asked. My voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. The infidelity clause in our prenup. I signaled to Rosalind, who clicked a button. The projector image changed instantly. It was a photo of Julian and his assistant, Sarah, kissing outside a motel room off Interstate 95. The timestamp was from 3 days ago. You planned to frame me for cheating, I said. But it turns out, you are the only one who broke our vows. The collective gasp turned into disgusted murmurs. I hadn't invited Sarah. But I saw Julian's eyes dart to his phone, likely thinking of her. He realized she was compromised too. She's already speaking to the police. Julian. I lied smoothly. She didn't want to go down for your embezzlement scheme. It wasn't true yet, but it would be by morning. The color drained from his face completely. He realized his escape route was gone. He looked at the garden gate, measuring the distance to his car. He actually tensed his legs to run. He took one step toward the driveway, but 2 uniformed officers stepped out from behind the hedgerow. They moved with the heavy, inevitable momentum of justice. Julian Mercer, the taller officer said, his hand resting on his holster. You are under arrest for fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy. They didn't give him time to argue. They spun him around, pressing his face against the rough bark of the oak tree. The click of handcuffs echoed across the silent lawn. It was the sweetest sound I had ever heard. As they hauled him upright, Julian twisted his head to look at me. His eyes were wide and wet, panic finally shattering his mask. Eliana, wait! He shouted, struggling against the officer's grip. Think about the baby. You can't raise a child without a father. We can fix this. I did it for us. He was begging now, stripping away the last of his dignity. Don't let our child grow up alone. I love you, Eliana. Please, tell them to stop. It was pathetic. I walked down the steps of the gazebo until I was standing right in front of him. I placed a protective hand over my stomach. You are confused, Julian, I said, my voice low and steady. This child doesn't have a father. This child has a donor. I looked at Derek, who nodded solemnly, then back at the man in handcuffs. And I am not alone. I have my mother. I turned my back on him. Get him off my property. The rejection was absolute. The officers dragged him toward the patrol car parked in the driveway. He was still shouting my name, but his voice grew fainter with every step. I didn't watch him go. I looked at the guests, who were staring at me with a mix of fear and awe. My mother walked up beside me and handed me a glass of sparkling water. Well done, she whispered. The air in the garden felt lighter, cleaner. The parasite was finally gone. I took a deep breath of freedom. 6 months later. The silence in the house was no longer heavy, it was peaceful. I sat in the nursery, folding tiny onesies that smelled of lavender and hope. The legal storm had passed quickly, leaving Julian stripped of everything he had tried to steal. The judge gave him 8 years for the embezzlement alone. with the fraud charges stacked on top. He tried to send letters from prison, but I burned them unopened in the fireplace. His voice had no place in this room anymore. My mother sat in the rocking chair, her knitting needles clicking a steady rhythm against the quiet. Catherine said, pausing to look at the crib. I never thought I'd see this room filled with anything but dust. I smiled, smoothing the fabric of a soft yellow blanket. We had spent the last half-year rebuilding the bridge I had torched for a liar. She didn't say, "I told you so," once. Her presence was the apology I needed, and the forgiveness I didn't deserve. When the contractions started a week later, fear spiked in my chest. I was terrified that I would look into my child's eyes and see a stranger's reflection. I was scared. I would see the clinical deception that created him. But when the doctor placed him on my chest, wet and squalling, the fear evaporated. He didn't look like a transaction or a crime. He looked like a miracle. He had my nose in a fierce, demanding cry that was all his own. Back home, I opened the safe in the study. Inside lay a small metal box containing Derek Sykes's information. I traced the name on the file, thinking about the young man who had stood beside me in the garden. He had declined any involvement, grateful just to escape Julian's web without a record. I placed the file inside and locked the box tight. My son would have the truth one day if he asked. But for now, he didn't need a father to be whole. I walked back to the nursery where Leo was sleeping. The afternoon sun filtered through the curtains, painting stripes of gold on the carpet. I picked him up, his weight solid and warm against my shoulder. People had told me I couldn't do this alone, that a child needs two parents to thrive. They were wrong. Julian had been a dead weight, dragging me down into the dark. Without him, I was lighter, stronger, and finally able to breathe. I was more than enough. I thought about Dr. Thorne, the woman whose shaking hands had saved my life. If she hadn't broken protocol, if she hadn't risked her career to show me that note, I would still be souping next to a monster. She gave me the truth, and it burned my old life to the ground. I looked down at Leo, who grasped my finger with a grip of iron. The fire was worth it. From the ashes, I had built a life that was finally, beautifully real.